potentially electronic publishers as well. Sam?
What's back to that? Oh, back to me. Oh, I thought you were just mentioning me. I didn't notice.
No, I'm giving you a chance.
Well, so are you talking about the thing I was showing earlier?
I'm talking about the thing that's noodling in the back of your head.
Yeah, it's not really in the back of my head anymore. I actually reached out to a bunch of queer creators, people who have had their print books in the Prism Comics booth before. And I asked a bunch of them to send me digital files because one of the things I wanted to include as a big part of the Northwest Press business plan, and there is a Northwest Press business plan. I learned a lot from looking at all those business plans. Digital was a big part of it because I want to make sure that when it reaches the point where digital is a big player in comics publishing, you need to have things in place already to be distributing in that way. And so they sent me digital files. I'm working with a developer in Seattle to put together a gay comics app, which is basically a virtual version of a Prism Comics booth where everyone comes and brings their stuff together. They're all selling on consignment. They're all making the majority of the money from sales are all going to them because it's a kind of a community group. And I'm doing that same thing in a digital format. So you'll be able to download an app for free from the App Store and go to your iPad and buy comics. And most of the money will go to the creators, and it'll be something that will be a little bit of money for Northwest Press, but mostly just an outreach tool and a way to give back to the community.
Will adult comics be part of that?
Absolutely, because so I wrote an article about how Apple was, they have content review, I'm not sure if you know this, but everything that goes through their App Store, they review before they approve it to be in the App Store. Fair enough. Everything they sell through an app that is in the App Store, so a book, a comic, any kind of content, that's also all reviewed. And they take a cut of all those too. So you have them taking 30% out of every comic book that gets sold through a comics portal app, like IDW and Iverse and all those, Comixology, all those comics apps, they charge half the price to their content providers because Apple's already taking 30%. So the Kindle doesn't do that. You go to the Kindle store and you buy a comic, you go back to your Kindle app, it goes out to the Kindle store and downloads the app directly. So Apple's not involved. So they're not involved for the cut, they're not involved for the content review. And so hopefully, and this is still going to depend on whether or not Apple believes that Kindle and this comics app are very similar paradigms and approve it. And if they don't, you'll hear about it from me. This is a way to sidestep that whole process, not involve Apple in making decisions about what's adult and what's not adult, what's porn and what's not porn. Sorry, Steve Jobs. But it'll be a way to actually do that, provide a wide variety of content, and make it something that could actually be a living for somebody who's producing a lot of work, because the majority of the sale, like 70% of the sale, will go to the person who saw the book. So I've got about 40 titles. If you come by the Prism booth tomorrow, I'll be able to show you a demo of the app. It's pretty sweet.
One thing I'd like to put into context here is that these kind of new projects are really important, given that traditionally in the past, LGBT comics have existed in their own kind of parallel universe to the rest of the comic book world. They were, comics were serialized in gay newspapers, they were sold and they were published by gay presses, they were sold in gay bookstores. So, disconnected from the rest of the publishing world, from the rest of the comic book world, and but kind of internally self-consistent and self-sustaining. And so someone like Alison Bechdel could do Begs to Watch Out For and actually make a living out of it in this world. But that stuff is falling apart now. I mean, the gay bookstores are falling apart, the gay presses, the gay newspapers. So we're at this interesting transition point, especially as queer cartoonists, where we're looking for another way to get our work out there. Some people can now transition into the mainstream, like the David Sedaris's or Alison Bechdel's new project, Fun Home. Was able to come into the mainstream, but not everybody. Haddad Paisan, homicidal lesbian terrorist, is never going to be, acceptable to like a mainstream straight audience. So what happens to that work now? We need to find other ways to get LGBT comics out to the market's still there. There are people who are still interested in the work. The question is now how to get it out there without a kind of defined media, queer media machine behind it.
So I think the grant is. I think the grant is definitely about encouraging people to think of what those ways are going to be, like what are those solutions going to be, and I think that's going to help a lot to figure out how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
So, what a perfect cue. This is sort of a very special episode of Blossom kind of question, but for the three of you guys, are there anything you learned about yourself, your process, the process as a whole, just by working through the grant application process and the things that you had to do to support that? Not just about our process, but about the whole thing that you might not have been, completely ready for, or just it was a revelation during the process.
I think I kind of felt a little hard pressed to contextualize my comic a little bit. I don't consider what I do, for those of you that are familiar, sort of like issues-oriented work. It's just sort of cutesy, it's like a romance comic, there's some comedic aspects to it. But it really got me thinking as I was writing the proposal, like how the oath stuff fits into, the larger sort of queer comics genre. And I started to think about, at least in the opening sort of paragraph, how, ultimately I kind of started doing it because I was not seeing this type of character, maybe not this one in particular, but let's say larger, sort of more rotund characters, representing comics, and especially mainstream comics. Those types of characters are usually like the bad guys, or they're sort of like heels or something like that.
Or that's their superpower, like the law.
I started to kind of write from that place, like this is perhaps, it's sort of funny because I'm from San Francisco, and in some ways the Bears kind of rule Castro at the moment. It's only in cities sort of like that, where they're sort of, they're becoming more of a mainstream presence or a recognizable presence. But as far as comics go, I was not seeing a lot of those characters, even in my initial sort of forays into queer comics. So I started to kind of write about, in my proposal, how I wanted to kind of have that kind of character be a part of the larger landscape, have some more visibility. So, my comic has those, I call them oaths. That's sort of my euphemism for bear or whatever label you sort of want to apply to that physique. But I also sort of have a lot of other, the tension actually between the two main characters, that one is a little guy and one is a big guy. And I'm kind of interested in playing with the dynamics of, chaser. I kind of hate that word. So my comic is all about the chaser getting chased, essentially, and just kind of lending some new narratives to the queer comics narrative. So that was really kind of what I used as my, not cred, and not like excuse to be sort of going for a grant, but certainly like the premise and how I was kind of contributing to the larger scene that I was sort of discovering, and that these guys are all obviously part of it.
I guess for me it was a couple things. I came to self-publishing. I had been published professionally, for lack of a better word, before through Fantagraphics, Heroes Comics Line, and dealing with them was great, and it was also frustrating because they dropped the ball in a lot of ways in terms of pursuing gay bookstores, because there were still gay bookstores at that point when it was coming out, and they didn't seem very interested in pursuing those venues. And I guess what I realized is if I'm going to sell 1,500 copies of something, I'd be better off printing those 1,500 myself and doing it, especially if no one's going to listen to my ideas and suggestions. So I guess I learned some resilience from it, but also just I really like the process of pre-press, like dealing with trim size and all these weird sort of design details.
Hire you, please.
I'm learning more about publication design, and I like it. I'm looking at previous stuff on design before and go, oh shit, what did I do that for? But I guess I'm building a skill set through doing it myself. There's other things that are more frustrating because I'm really not a publicist. I cannot self-promote to save my life. And if anyone ever wants to be a volunteer, to do that for me, great. Please do, because it's one thing that cartoonists do really badly is talk about themselves and toot their own horn. So it was good from that perspective, and it was also good because the book I'd done previously, Sticky, was basically, it was a fuck book. It was sex only, and this allowed me an opportunity to show that I could do other things as well. So it broadened my artistic palette as well.
I definitely I find that the process of applying for one of these grants, and I also I got the Xeric as well as Steve a number of years ago, and that was the first time I dealt with like, looking into the comic book world, and comics can be a very lonely art form. I mean, it requires a lot of time on, change your drawing table, and I was also doing it in a kind of vacuum. I didn't have any other cartoonist friends at the time and stuff. So learning about the whole world that it was a steep learning curve, and it was something that happened because of the grant process, and that process continued when I did the Career Press grant. This might be a little bit off topic, but to dovetail on what Ed was talking about, that Dove comes out of this kind of San Francisco, particular San Francisco subculture that people outside of that may or may not know much about, even within the queer community. The same thing is true with Amazonia. The tagline is the uncanny super training. There's a kind of underground drag culture in San Francisco that includes drag queens, drag kings, folk queens, trans women, trans men, and people kind of perform gender. I mean, obviously all gender is performance. It's a kind of basic tentative feminism. But some people do it very deliberately and consciously, and this is very much a kind of underground San Francisco aesthetic. And people call each other tranny within this community and the scene. There's Tranny Shack, is a kind of very famous drag / kind of trans review in San Francisco. And this is very much based on that. I recently I'm thinking about this because right before I came to the convention, a trans woman friend of mine called me on that term and said that this sometimes is an offensive, that she had a problem with this term. It can be used as a hate term and made her feel bad. And it was shocking to me because other trans friends of mine have loved this character and gotten behind it. She didn't necessarily come out of a kind of camp. She had never performed with camp and kind of done that kind of stuff before, so camp sensibility, I should say. So I was kind of curious about asking the other panelists and also maybe the people here. What you think of this kind of term. I certainly don't want to ever offend people, but at the same time, certain terms that are kind of reclaimed, like queer, for example, which some lesbians and gays and bisexuals and transgenders still have a problem with that term, with the term queer, but it has been reclaimed. How much is training being reclaimed? It depends on the person. So that was, it's a little bit of a infuriating subject, but okay. Come back to it.
And for the queer theory grant.
Yeah, right.